Hello, everyone, and welcome to this AKC Conversation. My name is Daniel Nilsson Dehanas, and I'm very happy to be joined today by Dr. Eka Ikpe. Welcome, Eka. Really great to have you here.
Great to be here.
So Dr. Eka Ikpe is Senior Lecturer in Development Economics in Africa. She publishes extensively on political economy and on aspects of transformation processes in the African contexts. And she is speaking in relationship to the series that we completed on Voices in the Wilderness, Leadership in Troubled Times. And in fact, one of Eka's roles is as Deputy Director of the African Leadership Center at King's College London. So it's very apt for her to be one of the speakers that gets into these issues of leadership today. And so without further ado, I'll ask some questions and we'll have a conversation. And let's just begin by talking about the African Leadership Center at King's. Could you tell us about what kind of work that center does?
Absolutely. So thank you very much for having me, Dan. Very pleased to be here. And so, yes, I'll talk about my home, as it were, at King's, the African Leadership Center, the ALC, as many of us tend to call it, is an institution that's really about building a new generation of critical thinkers and scholars and practitioners. And to us, there's certain core values that are very much at the center of what we're doing, what we're trying to do. One of those is centering youth agency. So recognizing that the youth constituency is a very powerful one, is one that's often overlooked, but really needs to be placed more on a platform, because a lot of what we're trying to do, myself as a development economist, about thinking of futures, for instance. How about those that are going to making those decisions and are going to really be at the helm of things, as we go forward. So that's very critical to what we do, a respect for diversity in all its forms, a pursuit for excellence, and also prioritizing processes of change that are driven by ideas and processes that come from the African continent. And also, by extension, think about wider global South context. Really, if we think of it this way, really elevating the ideas that are already there, and making space to celebrate those ideas and to take them very seriously. So this is the space that I work in, and this is really very much the work that we are trying to do. Yeah.
Excellent. And I mean, much of the news coverage that I see about Africa, or have seen across my life, has been relatively pessimistic and negative. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on Afro-pessimism, or these sorts of negative ways in which Africa is often framed.
It's a very good question. And I guess for me, at the center of Afro-pessimism, the challenges around that, is really how they're founded on simplistic and reductionist narratives, and an unwillingness to think of this, very vibrant but also challenging space, as many other parts of the world are, in complex ways. And we need to recognize you can have high growth and you can have unemployment. You can have growth that's coming from mineral resources, and can also generate conflict as a result of that reliance on mineral resources. We can think of how conflict can present opportunities for transformation as well, because you have a breakdown in systems that have been problematic for a large majority of people within some of these spaces. And conflict can have the effect of forcing people to listen to one another, for also elevating voices that are generally ignored, right? It can have that effect. You're forcing everyone to be still and pay attention in ways that they weren't listening before. And so I think, it's very important to think of all these sides, of all these facets of the continent. And for me, Afro-pessimism is also a showing of a bit of intellectual laziness as well, in terms of how we're thinking of this space, but it's also, located in a history about thinking about Africa. It's not something from today. It's the sort of path dependence around what we're seeing today. I mean, I think another point I want to make around this is also how we can think of Africa as a continent of peoples with shared histories, but also a collective of very different and very diverse countries and nations and peoples, and variation in those histories as well. So I mentioned that especially because it's often a challenge. It's like, oh, we can't talk about Africa as a space, but it's very diverse, and it can be difficult for people to understand. It can be all of those things, really. And I think this is what we miss out with this sort of more Afro-pessimist approach to thinking about and understanding the continent. But something else I want to say as well is, how we engage with the material we see is also down to our own choices, right? In terms of media, in terms of scholarship as well, we make choices as sort of consumers of that material around, what we choose to pay attention to and the work we are willing to do to seek out alternative stories to those that are often thrust in front of us. And I think, we have responsibilities to actually, I think we're in the age of technology, as is often put forward. So there is so much that's available. Yeah. That's telling all kinds of stories about the continent. And we also need to take responsibility for engaging with that diversity of material that is available.
Can I ask quickly if you have a couple of recommendations of where to look for better information or a more diverse set of information on the continent?
Absolutely. So when I think in terms of scholarship, so actually I've just been invited to join the editorial board of a journal with the I guess I would say the premier, of course I would, the Council for Codesria, which is, I think now it's escaping me the full term there, but they run, I think is one of the most established journals that's thinking about African development. Okay. And that's run out of Codesria in Senegal. And there you have a very vibrant discussion that has gone on across time about development on the continent that really centers narratives that come out of the continent, that really centers the continent also as a space for generating concepts and generating theories as well. Of course, very critical perspectives as well, and an interdisciplinary approach to the work that's being done. But I think Codesria in general has a whole range of publications where they've done a lot of work around elevating the scholarship that's going on the continent, but also in collaboration with African diasporas, of course, which is another huge constituency to think about. When I think in terms of media, I think there's one outlet that I've found really interesting, and that's allafrica.com. I think they have a huge range of others, but I like allafrica.com because what it does is it pulls together media articles from newspapers on the continent itself. So journalism from Africa itself. So again, you get such a breadth and covering all, the countries on the continent. Of course, when we talk about this space, and all I'm saying is focus very much on sort of Anglophone work. And we have another challenge in terms of language where you have, English as the majority on the continent that tends to silence a lot of fascinating work and material that's going on, in Francophone regions and Lusophone regions as well. Mm-hmm. And you have these silos as well, where there are challenges with how you have conversations across these groups. Of course, Codesria, let me say, is bilingual, so works both in French and in English as well. So that's a big step up in that regard.
Fantastic, really useful recommendations. Thank you for those. Now, your work is in development economics. How does political leadership feature in that kind of work?
No, absolutely. My work, I think a big part of my research has been around understanding the role of the state in development. So certainly political leadership, if you think of political elites as occupying, if you like, the apparatus of the state. And we can think about how the decisions they take, of course, they're hugely influential to the sort of developmental agenda, which is often, underpinned by what needs to go on in the economic space, dynamism in the economic space. And a lot of that is also drawn from, what's been termed developmental states in Asia, right? And this very specific and particular interpretation of sort of rapid transformation that went on from the 1960s to about the 1990s, where you saw this, well, how it's been painted, this very central role for the state, and also a depiction of states and the actors that occupy those states as being all powerful and able to, almost single-handedly influence development policies, be able to choose winners and losers in these spaces, be able also to negotiate with, sort of international economic dynamics as well in all of this, with some of the policies that they put in place. And my interest here was also because it painted a different picture to sort of mainstream thinking about the role the state should play in development. We tended to be a more passive, a more supportive, enabling role to a sort of ideological position that sees markets and private sector actors as sort of superior in terms of the kind of efficiency they can deliver in economic affairs. And for me, what's also very interesting about this is it's centering experiences from global South contexts, right? It's putting those at the center. And I think it was a very major intervention that was saying we can theorize from spaces outside of the global north when we're thinking about development. And my work has also tried to extend that to think of how do we center African contexts, beyond this focus on Asia, and what can that tell us about certain African spaces as well.
And if you could just elaborate for the wide range of people who'd watch this, when you're talking about those places in Asia that have that influence or potential influence, are we speaking about China primarily, or some other places, or what are the assumptions, and then how are those countered? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think, again, very good question. Developmental states, sort of the traditional set, we're talking about Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. These were sort of a first three that were put forward as these are fascinating cases of growth, and especially growth that was based on industrial transformation, right? So a change in how the economy was structured, moving from agriculture to industry, which for us economists is very important because it means you're using more science and technology. It means also that your economies are relying on goods that have greater demand globally and more sustained demand globally. And they have prices that are not, subject to these whims like commodities. You always hear of these crises that are to do with petroleum prices, copper prices. Manufactured goods, the assumption there is that they don't suffer those dips and also perhaps those highs in the same way. So they provide more stability. But also this, based on also this idea of modernization, right? That you want to move to where you're using more science and tech. So this was a sort of first group. A next group, you're thinking of Indonesia, Thailand also came into those conversations. Philippines at times was brought in there. And it's interesting that you mentioned China, which is not often, it's not necessarily treated as a developmental state, but certainly there is almost a trajectory, a story about Asian, especially in East Asia and this part of Southeast Asia I've referenced, a development where China also, you see that very strong role, very central role for the state. You see a lot of reliance also on industrial development and this idea of transformation from agriculture, which is seen as more traditional, to what is seen as modern industrialization. So certainly I would see China in a similar tradition, but on a huge scale, of course, because of the size of China. And if you think about this in African context, I've looked at Ethiopia in this way because of very high growth rates, but in a different sense, because Ethiopia's tried this story of transition, relying very much on resources that are coming from outside Ethiopia. So for instance, China has provided a lot of financial, there's a lot of that sort of exchange. So Ethiopia allows us to look at a different story where we're thinking again about a state that has been very focused on a move from a traditional sector to industry, but has had to do so based on those resources it's getting from outside. And what are the additional dynamics that introduces? How reliable is that? What are you subject to because of that reliance, for instance?
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. I mean, one thing that I really appreciated from reading some pieces of your work is that you do cite and bring into conversation many African theorists and development economists and others in building this picture. And my question for you now is by opening up our conversations to include more voices from Africa, how does that enrich our wider conversations on economics and politics? How does that actually change the ways that we think about economics and politics?
Yeah, no, I think, again, a really, really significant point. I think beyond anything, it deepens, our, intellectual enterprise, if you like, as scholars. It's a broader range we're thinking about. It means the work is richer. And for me, for my work, certainly what has been very important has been the way that critical African scholarship especially, has challenged sort of disciplinary dichotomies in my work. The way they've said thinking about economics here and politics there is not useful for spaces that are so dynamic, spaces that are about change, because, and a key scholar here, Claude Ake, is Nigerian, but was a very prominent critical, I would say, a political economist. And his point was that actually the traditions of disciplines speak to the colonial heritage of scholarship in many parts of Africa, but they're problematic because they rely on the study of order. This is how he saw it. They rely on the study of order and not of change and transition. Which many global South contexts are, what is normal is not order. What is normal is change and dynamism. And there's a way that these spaces are othered because they don't fit into these orders, right? We speak about, instead of analyzing the complex interactions between those who occupy the state and private sector actors, we depict that as problematic, whereas that is the reality within those spaces. And so for me, it was this challenging us even in terms of the tools, in terms of how we're understanding things, in terms of how we're engaging theories. How do we deal with those theories critically, and how do we center the empirical spaces we're working within in engaging that? So it's also a hierarchy in terms of theory and empirical reality, right? Because I was taught in this system that I studied in the UK and everywhere, actually in global South context as well, theory is king, if you like. Right. And you just apply it in the empirical spaces. But what happens when we challenge that hierarchy? That's something I've learned a lot about from African scholarship on the continent.
Yeah, when the empirics don't really match up with the theory, how do you revise the theories or go back to the drawing board, basically? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one thing that you're raising right now, actually, in a really interesting way, are those colonial legacies of scholarship. And one role that you have at King's is that you are one of the leads of the Decolonizing the Curriculum initiative for social sciences and public policy.
Yeah.
And so how would you explain to us what it means to decolonize the curriculum?
Yeah, no, I think, a very key subject, a very key topic right now. And I think thinking of our work and how we're framing it, again, it's about saying our starting point is we have to recognize there is a challenge, that we have a problem. And in that, what we're trying to do is provide a space where we can safely query some of the assumptions that have underpinned our approaches to higher education and research as well, how we teach and how we carry out research. And it's something I said before, I think people should be encouraged, and we're trying to encourage our colleagues to say this is about also enhancing our intellectual depth and our intellectual breadth as well in terms of knowledge production, teaching and learning practices. So we should see this as advantageous. You see this as taking us forward. And in that, what we're trying to do is think about practicable steps, because there's also a sense in which we talk about decolonization of the curriculum and there's a shutdown or there's a panic and it's like, where am I going to start? I'm so far behind. There's nothing I can do about this. But no, we want to say, it starts with a step. It starts even with a commitment to say, I recognize there's a challenge and there is a problem. But, we also recognize we have been trained in these systems. As I said, I did a lot of my own higher education study here in the UK. But, many colleagues that have studied, on the continent as well, certainly in my own home country, Nigeria, have gone through similar systems because of what Claude Ake said about this inherited educational systems, higher education systems in much of the continent. Mm-hmm. So we need to recognize those challenges and then begin to ask questions about what can we do around that. And it's about not just the scholarship, not just the research, because you say this and most people say, okay, what can I do to diversify my reading list? It's more fundamental than that. It's also about how are we teaching? How are we teaching to very diverse groups of students? And in my own classrooms are quite very diverse groups of students where they all feel present, where they all feel like I'm speaking to them, I'm engaging with them. How do I adapt to recognize that? How do I see the world through the eyes of those students in my classroom? And it's a tall order and we won't always get it right, but even recognizing that I need to be doing that is key. We're hesitating about saying this is exactly how you will do this, because I think it depends on where you are, where you're located, where you're seated. What is meant for me has been very different to what is meant for people in other disciplines, for instance. But I think it's very much about elevating knowledge sources that are going to broaden how we think about a subject. It's about issues like historicizing a particular topics that we're dealing with. And also it's about explaining why we're doing this. It's about saying to students, actually the reason why I have to go back and I feel like I'm bringing scholars into this conversation is because they have been removed from this conversation. It's about thinking of knowledge hierarchies in the classroom. So we're studying about this person. This is required reading. You can't study this subject without reading this person. Why is that? Is it simply because this is the best scholar on the subject? And there are other factors that have informed why this is a central text in this classroom. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I think you've implied this or given us a good sense of this in some ways already. But as this is being viewed by a wider AKC community and a wider King's community, what would be your first steps if you wanted to, as a student or as somebody writing or working in these areas, if you wanted to engage in a serious way with decolonizing their curriculum or decolonizing knowledge in your particular area? I guess it varies per person and per context, but are there some things that you might say would be helpful starting points or ways of practically going forward?
No, absolutely. And I guess I can speak from what is it meant for me? What have I, how have I gone on this, have I gone on this journey? And I think certainly one aspect is some of what I referenced before, is saying how do we theorize from a different basis, from a different space to global north spaces. And that's because in my discipline, if you think of development economics, all the classic theories you're taught speak about transition and transformation. Well, many of them, let me not say all, many of them speak about transformation, transition, from experiences in North America around that. From experience, I think of John Maynard Keynes, the key a scholar around development economics, and he was speaking about recovery, Europe's recovery from the Second World War. Really, that was the birth of development economics, and the idea was we can think of development as recovery, because a lot of those ideas about the role the state can play in sort of putting in place this recovery was taken from Europe, and thinking about African spaces, Asian spaces as sort of recovery from colonization. And there's a reason why you saw those transfer of ideas. Part of it was linked to the fact that you were seeing the end of colonization in parts of Asia and Africa, and part of almost a parting gift was this a conversation about what development and transformation could look like drawing from this European experience. Now, I'm not saying in itself that is, put that in the bin. No, I think I found some of those conversations useful. But in my classroom, for instance, I make that very clear. We go back, where is this theory from? What is the empirical roots? Because also I always say to my students, theories don't fall from the sky. What is the empirical rooting of this idea? Why are certain ideas more prominent in certain periods than others? And these are things some of us are doing, but it's just how we couch that conversation and how we locate power hierarchies within that. Because a lot of this, I think centers on, when we talk about decolonization, hierarchies are very central to that. Recognizing what hierarchies exist in those spaces, I think, is very, very critical. What kind of power relations we're dealing with. I think those of us saying we need to talk about this because many of those I know and are assuming away power hierarchies, right? We just treat this as given. They're not given. They're rooted in certain realities. And I think, centering this is a very good starting point. Where can I identify levers of power, of hierarchy in the work that I'm doing, especially around how knowledge is being produced, is being consumed, and what is informing some of those hierarchies that we find ourselves working within.
Yeah, no, that gives me a lot to think about, definitely. So really, really, really helpful to consider that further. Now, one thing that we talked about earlier in this conversation is that there are many stories of Africa. There are many ways in which the continent is shaped, and countries have different sorts of experiences. One thing that I think is really relevant and worth thinking about with leadership is this past year with COVID-19. How have different African countries fared? What have we learned from experiences in Africa with trying to deal with the leadership challenges of COVID-19?
Yeah, no, I think indeed. I mean, I think everywhere this has been a very difficult, very sad time. But space to really observe and learn if we're willing to, because of course it shows up, in sharp relief, some of what might have been hidden otherwise. And I think when we think of, I speak of the continent, but of course it's very diverse, very wide ranging, but there are certain things that we've heard about, for instance, in the beginning, and I would say even up until now, in terms of how outcomes have not been as dire as had been predicted. The sort of panic that greeted the pandemic. In some situations, it has been horrific. You think of South Africa, you think of some parts of North Africa, as well, where it's been hugely challenging. I know Egypt had a very difficult bout at a certain period as well, but South Africa really has taken the brunt of this. And it's quite interesting how, for instance, some of the larger, South Africa is the most industrialized economy on the continent, is the one actually facing these huge challenges. Some have argued that is linked to the fact that actually there's much more monitoring going on in South Africa around this than in other spaces. So the fact that we're not seeing those same sort of results in other spaces speaks also to the way in which, the way in which data is being presented, or used, or even collated, or what is even available as well. So that, there's been that. But I think in general, this point about, the surprise that it's not been as dire as was predicted, has been key, and how that some of those conversations have been linked to the data problem that we don't know actually, but also conversations about early lockdowns, very decisive action in the beginning, maybe less so now, but certainly in the beginning, conversation about learning from Ebola, that the continent, some economists, you think of West Africa, I think of, Nigeria was very successful managing Ebola, even had a film made about some of its experiences. And you think of Sierra Leone in terms of those that experienced Ebola before, and that provided some know-how around dealing with this. So those points have been put forward, even attempts to provide some relief during lockdowns as well. And then, of course, also economic recovery that has been quicker than also was anticipated. Now, this doesn't detract from the fact that you have had some problems with debt defaults, I think of Zambia, for instance. So it has been very difficult, and we still have rising poverty and problems with inflation. But you see, the picture here is also about these contradictions, right? These varied outcomes, because it's not simple, it's not straightforward. That's the reality, it is murky. But something that stood out for me also has been, I think, an unwillingness to attribute some of these outcomes to the agency of relevant actors. I remember in the beginning conversations about, oh, this is so surprising. Oh, it's because it's too hot. It's because there are loads of young people. Some even said, oh, it's because there's a lot of poverty, so there's a lot of resilience. And this is why the results are as they are. And I guess one could look at all of those things and check. I mean, it is a very young continent, of course, but I think that narrative really says a lot about the perception of the continent, how it is so difficult to actually imagine that there might be something that some actors are doing that we could look at. There might also be these challenges. There might be these realities that, I don't know, maybe, I mean, a lot of that debate about heat or cold weather or whatever, because people can be outside, but it's like impossible to imagine that, certain actors might be doing something that's working, and there's really nothing to learn, nothing to look at in this space. I thought that really stood out. This doesn't take away from the fact that real challenges have come up. You think of course, the tragic loss of life. We also see rising death rates presently. I mentioned rising poverty, problems with inflation as well. And also it showed up the huge challenges with healthcare systems on the continent. This is linked to the data problem that was also that I mentioned before as well. And then, of course, some sociopolitical challenges around repression. So the state has, been very forthright, has put in place lockdowns has been very strong, but linked to that have been some arguments around abuse of human rights, around repression as well. Even the way data has been used in some spaces. I think of Tanzania, for instance, misinformation really to serve a particular purpose and a particular narrative. And we've also seen a lot of protests on the continent, which we can read as a problem, but I also read as something to highlight as the dynamism and the agency of young people on the continent that will not remain silent in the face of many of these challenges. But I think that also speaks to long-standing issues where this is a sort of fault line that is really just giving the space for the challenges that have already been there. So you can sort of think of this as a catalyst, for driving, for I guess, providing space for those who have needed to say something. And here they find themselves in a situation where they can rise up and say what they need to say and be listened to as well.
Yeah, that is a very good segue actually to a rather big question that I have for you next, which is, what would you say are some of the largest challenges and opportunities facing Africa as we go forward into the 21st century?
Yeah, no, I think there are probably a whole host, and we could have another session.
Absolutely. The sequel. We'll do the sequel.
Exactly. But I think something that has really been on my mind is what I'll dwell on here, and that is sort of something that's been long-standing on the continent. Its commitment to regionalization, its commitment to Pan-Africanism. With the establishment of the Organization of African Unity in 1963 and its transition in the early 2000s to the African Union, and how this has political roots. I mean, the OAU was established to fight colonialism, to fight apartheid as well. But on the one hand, on the other hand, it was also about how do we recognize that the continent has been located in a particular position in the global economy as one that supplies commodities. So supplies your oil, your cocoa, your, whatever. You need rubber, but we'll buy the tires and we'll buy the chocolates and we'll buy the petrol even. And, it's recognized, and this is not, also because of, what I'd mentioned before, reliance on these commodities is not a secure basis for stable socioeconomic change and transformation and improvements. And recognizing that actually the way that we might be able to change this positioning might be to pull together, might be to think of how as a collective we find ourselves negotiating with the global economy, and recognizing that we are disadvantaged because of the legacy of colonization that actually positioned many economies on the continent in this space. And it's an enduring legacy. We talk about China, Africa, and the conversations that we're having about the global north and Africa, we're having again about China, Africa. And I think that says a lot about the path dependence here. Now it's something that really needs to be addressed. But now we have the promise of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And this has been organized around how do we elevate the significance and the importance of domestic markets, of the internal. Now, this doesn't mean let's, unplug from the global space. No, it's speaking about hierarchies. How do we say what we do amongst each other is also very important and potentially more important than what we do with the globe. And some of the reasons for that is, for instance, you see higher value trade going on within the continent. So African economies trade, sell commodities to the rest of the world. But within Africa, actually, they trade manufactured goods. It's far more diverse. It's a far more robust basis for sort of the transformation we want to see. So this African Continental Free Trade Area is about, it was, I think in January of this year, has been in place. And the idea is to reduce tariff barriers within the continent and encourage trade within the continent, and setting up barriers with the rest of the world. So this should encourage increased trade within the spaces and the movement of resources, but also thinking about how do we produce value closer to home? How do we process some of those commodities in a way that they can be used by those on the continent itself, right? It faces some challenges, that's the truth. I mean, infrastructural development on the continent is hugely problematic, have some of the highest transportation and communication costs in the world. And this is a huge, we're talking about regional trade. It's a problem. Sometimes it's cheaper in terms of transportation outside the continent can be cheaper than transportation within the continent. So this is a huge problem and a huge challenge that needs to be overcome. You have issues with energy as well. These are some of the handicaps around this. So how that is addressed becomes critical. Another key point, of course, is technology. And yes, on the African continent, there's a lot of celebration about technology, but I think that focuses a lot on its consumption of technology and not necessarily its production of technology, which leads to issues around technology dependence. And we've seen this with conversations about vaccine production, where that's another problem with COVID. Very, very poor access to vaccines and very poor vaccine coverage in Africa because it's relying on receiving vaccines. I think less than 1% of vaccines are produced in Africa. And we've seen that global north economies are not willing to waive their intellectual property rights to allow wider production. So you see the very real implications of this. There is promise, I would say. We have major problems with illicit financial outflows on the continent. And, some reports by, who was it? I think the UN Conference on Trade and Development suggests that stemming that tide could see inflows of about $89 billion per annum in Africa. And those are monies that should be on the continent and just dissipate. And some of the main destinations for that, I think it's important to note, China, the US, Japan, and the UK. So this needs sort of international commitment. They need to stem that tide as well. But those resources would be essential to addressing some of these challenges around infrastructure, these conversations about technology. I think, of course, we have to learn by doing. We have to borrow from those that have done this before. But as I said earlier, empirical realities on the continent can lead to knowledge, can lead to technology that others would not even be able to produce, would not even conceive. So the benefits are not just to the African continent, but to the wider globe as well.
Yes. And I imagine a lot of these developments in regionalization would be much more sustainable, better for the planet and the environment, that kind of thing as well. So there are a lot of ways in which actually these would be a kind of leadership to the rest of the globe if these are successful developments.
Absolutely. I mean, I think on regionalization, given what's happened with the UK, and Europe, and a lot of the issues and challenges with the EU, stories about how regionalization can be done. Africa can present leadership around that, how it's navigating some of those issues, some of those challenges. And as you said, certainly on climate change, this collective is a very important basis for the negotiations that need to go on in that way. We know that the continent is the least polluting space, but one of the most affected spaces globally. And part of that is also linked to the power dynamics within these debates on climate change. So we have a lot of those discussions, but we also know that's, while Africa is one of the worst affected spaces, we still have problems with the dumping of toxic waste in Africa because of the limited facilities and capacities to monitor that. And that's waste coming from Europe, in this age when we know the challenges and the issues here. Now, the extent to which it will be possible to negotiate and to challenge some of these quote unquote more powerful actors is potentially strengthened when this is done on a collective basis as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. These are such interesting and important developments, and thank you for sharing so much with us today through this conversation, Eka. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fantastic speaking with you. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.